you point out, and I think this is hard for us to imagine who are in the front row and had a certain life experience. A lot of the folks that you talk to, they don't want to leave. They're happy where they are. They can't imagine leaving. And they're living in places that people in the front row would struggle to find bearable. But they're happy in an emotional sense. They may have some material struggles, but they don't feel they could live anywhere else.
Right. I think it gets to a larger point that the thing we in the front row really only value things we can measure. I call them kind of economic metrics, things that, so you can't really put the value on the emotional attachment to place. And so we tend to dismiss it or ignore it or belittle it, when in fact, it's one of the few things we gift to people. It doesn't require credentials to have that. It just requires being born there. And so, all those what I call non-credentialed forms of meaning, things that are just kind of no barriers to entry, like place, other than what comes from birth, like place, like family, like faith. We tend to dismiss. I think not necessarily just because we don't believe them, but because we can't measure them. We can't really put our hands in grasp. Like, what's the importance of knowing that your family's been here 3 generations and they've all looked at the same hills and they've all walked up the same paths, and I think there's a lot of value in that. And a lot of people appreciate that and get a lot out of that, but I think we tend to ignore that value simply because we don't know how to think about it.
So I'm going to read an excerpt from the book, which you write. I was part of a global group of lawyers, bankers, business people, and professors who are their profession first and a New Yorker, Brit, or Southerner second. They're as comfortable in New York City as they are in London or Paris or Sao Paulo or Hong Kong. Well, in the right neighborhoods in each. In their minds, staying put is a mistake. If you stay, you limit your career, you limit your wealth, and you limit your intellectual growth. They also don't fully understand the value of place because, like religion, it's hard to measure. What's the value of staying near the family that raised you or in the valley where you were born? Had I asked those in my hometown when I visited why they stayed, why they were still there, I would have gotten the answer I heard from Cairo to Amarillo to rural Ohio. They would have looked at me like I was crazy, then said, because it is my home. It's an answer that is obvious because there is value in home, but it isn't just the value of the house or the yard. It's the connections, networks, friends, family, congregation, the Little League team, the usuals at the hairdresser, regulars at the bar, the union hall, the crew at the vape store, the regulars at the half-price movie night, the guys for Tuesday night basketball. The front row doesn't fully get that because they don't see that value. And like me, they moved before, and they'll probably move again. We have broken our connections and built new ones. If we can do it, so can anyone else, we think. And then later you write, you're talking to someone, and you say, ask him the question I already know the answer to. Why have you stayed here? He shoots back without any pause. Too many ties here, and it's as good a place as you can find. Do you like it here? Hell, I was born here. Have to like it. It is home. And I think you really, end a quote, I think, you nailed something there that I moved 6 or 7 times before I was 8 years old. My high school years were spent outside of Boston and Lexington, Massachusetts, but we moved when I was a junior to Israel, thinking we were going to stay there. My dad's company sent him there. We thought we were going to be there for a few years. That was just normal for me. I didn't think anything of moving. I didn't have a place that I would call home, except for maybe Memphis, where I was born, but never really lived, where I had a lot of family. And I think that sense of home for people like me, often highly educated, it is a bit alien for us. And you really, you capture the problem I think some of us have. I've said many times on this program that the problem of poverty is luggage. The people need to get out. And a lot of them don't want to. And that's hard for us to understand.
Right. It was hard for me to understand. I mean, again, even though I come from a small town, we were the outsiders in our small town. My dad was a German who had escaped Germany before the war. He was a professor in a town that didn't have any other professors, or just a few others. And so for me, moving was easy. It was never really my home, even though I had strong connections and appreciated my town. But so I did I leaped from there to college, to grad school, to New York. And then when I was in New York, I was traveling all over the world. So, I would have been a very different guest 20 years before. What I would have basically said, just move. Yeah. And I should have seen it, because I went home pretty regularly when my parents were alive, and just seen that this was what people wanted. But you're blind to things you don't want to necessarily think about, or it's a hard thing to come to realize. But I think, again, we just don't understand the value of place. And one of the things that frustrates me is, if you're on the left like I am, you're supposed to, in my mind at least, you're supposed to focus on the working poor, and respect them as much as you respect yourself and their views. And asking them to move is taking away one of the few pieces of capital they have, or devaluing it. Again, it's something that's gifted to them at birth, and so you're asking you're saying that piece of capital has no value, which is very elitist. But I would also say, at a more pragmatic level, I can put my old Wall Street hat on and say, you're also asking people to sell an asset into probably all-time lows. Yeah. And so you're asking them to take that luggage and sell it often, and in a market that might have crashed, right? Yeah. Or so that's you're asking them to cash out at a low. So look, I think I don't want to give the impression that a lot of people are that provincial in the sense, but there are people in, you can go to one of these towns and a guy will have lived there all his life, but he'll also jump in his truck and go work for a month up in North Dakota if there's a job, right? But he'll come back, and he won't move his family. Or a woman will, I was in Preston, in a small town in Kentucky, where I didn't see any black people except for one, and she was a nurse who had come from Cleveland to work in the hospital for 6 months and was staying in a hotel. So people do move for temporary employment, but in general, there's a lot of value to place.